I saw my worst nightmare come true when my husband found out about my secret lover. In my wildest dreams, I never imagined I'd be sitting in an ambulance with my AP, escorting him to the hospital after my husband almost broke all his bones. My name is Elise, and I've been married to my husband Ben for 5 years. We live in Detroit, Michigan. Despite 5 years of marriage, I never imagined my husband was as violent as he showed me he was 2 weeks ago. I'm even scared of going to beg him because I don't want to face him. Our marriage wasn't always like this. It started out great and respectful, but not all good things last forever. Ben and I have been the best of friends for years, and we've been through very tough times together. Over time, things started to get worse. We have 2 children together, a boy and a girl. They don't live with either of us at the moment. Things got so bad that our parents suggested that the children not stay with either of us. Ben is really angry that his parents don't want our kids to see him like this. As for me, I'm not in the right headspace to see my kids. So after having my second child 2 years ago, Ben and I started having serious issues. We argued a lot, constantly about many things. The root of our argument started with me getting insecure about his job. I hated seeing him go to work, knowing full well that he had colleagues. I know how childish that sounds, but it's the truth. His female colleagues are pretty and smart. I hated the fact that I couldn't pursue the same career goals as they did. I'm just a housewife. I felt like he had to stop working and stay home with me to raise the kids, even though I didn't have much experience. I didn't want him to quit his job entirely. I just wanted him to take a leave to make me feel better. But Ben said he needed to earn money to provide for our kids. After his father got involved, we settled things and stopped having arguments. Things were back to normal and arguments subsided. But that victory was only short-lived. A year ago, I went to Alabama for my best friend's wedding. The flight time is almost 14 hours, which is a long way to travel for a one-off wedding. My husband wasn't happy about me going, especially as I'd be leaving our 2 toddlers behind. He said I could only go if I took my 1-year-old. A year ago, I traveled to Alabama for my best friend's wedding. The distance from Detroit to Alabama is almost 14 hours by plane, which is a long way to travel for just one wedding. My husband didn't like the idea of his Zag Brahmer. I was old enough to know better than to do as he said. I told him to take care of himself. It just didn't make sense to me that he couldn't take up that responsibility for just a week when I had done the same thing for years. I left for Alabama without letting him know and left our house. I have kids, and I'm not a bad mother. I just noticed a break in my routine. I didn't understand why it was such a big deal for him to inconvenience himself for a week. He told me he had to go to work and couldn't take the kids with him, but I didn't care. Being a housewife isn't easy either way. I also have to make sacrifices, so I figured he had to do the same. The wedding was the biggest test of my marriage life. I was a married woman in a different environment, 14 hours away from my husband. I was left with my own thoughts and conscience. What could go wrong? Everything went wrong. I am no saint, and I accepted that the moment I saw the men in Alabama, they were young bachelors who were ready to mingle, whether you were single or not. Of course, I knew I had a husband, but the temptation was too much for just one person to resist. There was a cocktail party 3 nights before the wedding that really tested my morals. A guy named Nick offered to be my date for the night. I did try to deny him the chance, but he was persistent, and I found myself attracted to his persistence. I knew being close to Nick would bring trouble, but the trouble he brought was covered up in his sexy stare and attractive body. Nick was a big temptation that I didn't end up overcoming. He had a charming smile and seductive personality, and he never ceased to cross the line and touch me inappropriately. I can't blame Nick entirely, though. I was also leading him on and testing the waters. I told him I was single and hid my wedding ring in my bag. I even removed the picture of Ben and my kids that I had as my home screensaver. I wanted to. I was trying to come across as a single woman, and that's how badly I fell for him. I didn't even want him to know I have kids. Some people might think what I did is shameful, and I agree, but not everyone is able to resist the temptation that's constantly being dangled in their face. I lacked self-control. I didn't have any control with Nick. I didn't even try to resist him. Nick is smart, and he played his cards well. He saw how excited I got when he was near, and he used that to his advantage. For me, it wasn't just lust. I saw someone new in a relationship that was fresh without any history or misunderstanding. It was something different from being married with kids and responsibilities. I finally understood why Ben was so unhappy. He wanted me to take the kids with me. My kids would have reminded me of my responsibilities as a mother and wife, but with them nowhere to be found, it was easy to forget that I was married with children. No one knew of me there except my best friend and her husband. She was too busy with her wedding to know that I was about to commit adultery. Nick loved to play dangerous games, and I didn't stop him. He would whisper nonsense into my ear and I bruleth. By the end of the cocktail party, I'd kissed Nick at least 3 times. I knew he'd invite me to his room, and I was right. I went with no hesitation. Even now, I'll always admit Nick has a way with words. He has a way with people that makes you do things you wouldn't normally do. I hate Nick because of what he did to me. That night, Nick and I got chatting and he told me some lovely things. He said I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. I'm not easily swayed by such words, but on that night, I was completely taken in. Nick completely brainwashed me, and I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. We started making out, and before I knew it, I'd lost my self-control. I ended up sleeping with him the next morning. I had a bath with him and ate breakfast in his room. In fact, I did everything with him that day. I even skipped my best friend's brunch with us as the bridesmaids. I was too smitten with Nick to go to brunch. I didn't want the wedding to end, because I knew I would have to go back to reality and face my husband and children. I knew I would feel guilty, but that didn't stop me from sleeping with Nick for the rest of the trip. I even moved from my hotel room into his, because I felt it would be easier to access him that way. I became a full wife to a man I'd barely met for a week on the day of the wedding and trip. Nick promised me he would be coming to see me in Detroit once in a while. He lived in Alabama, but told me he was also from Detroit and had family. I was happy to see him again, but I knew I couldn't control myself. I was sane enough to know I couldn't act the same way with him like I did in Alabama. I didn't want to air my dirty laundry and expose my cheating habit. I also didn't want Nick to find out I was married with children. It became my dirty little secret to keep my AP and my husband away from each other. I never let them meet, but it seems that karma has a way of catching up with you. They did meet, and it ended in broken bones. Before the fight happened, there was a backstory, so I'll fill you in on how my husband went from not knowing I was cheating to beating Nick up. It takes a blind person not to notice a shift in their spouse's aura and movements. Ben is definitely not blind. After returning from Alabama, he watched me like a hawk. I've come to realize that people who have more to hide often try to act and appear normal. That's what happened to me. I tried too hard to act like everything was fine, which made it easy for Ben to suspect something was going on. It was the first time I'd cheated on Ben since I got married. In fact, it was the first time I'd cheated since I'd always been loyal to my previous partners. Even those who didn't lead to marriage. So, after cheating on my husband, it was almost impossible to be in the same room with him. Nick isn't someone you can easily manipulate. He has a lot of confidence and intuition. First of all, he held a grudge against me for leaving for Alabama without telling him. Taking our daughter like he suggested and leaving before he woke up was a big deal to him. He felt disrespected. When I got back, Nick confronted me about leaving the way I did. I decided to act defensive. I didn't want him to know I was wrong and had disrespected him in our marriage. Nick refused to believe me. No matter what I said, he said I was hiding something. He said that the way I left was too suspicious and that I was up to no good. I knew I'd rather chew a jean jacket than admit that I'd cheated on him or even had the intention to cheat. I decided to gaslight him and then act nonchalant. After that, I just couldn't tell him the truth because I knew he'd kick me out without waiting for an explanation. I knew Nick would never forgive me if he found out I'd cheated. He has zero tolerance for adultery and infidelity. These are things we already spoke about before getting married. We'd spoken about this before getting married, so I knew I couldn't get away with it no matter what I said. That's why I decided to just play it cool and hope he'd forget all about it. I got back to my duties in due course and resumed being a housewife. My relationship with Ben was still rocky because I could tell he still had his suspicions, but I tried not to make things worse and just give it time. After a few weeks, we felt like we were back to how we used to be. I forgot all about Nick and got back to my normal life, but that was only the calm before the storm. For months after the Alabama episode, Nick contacted me again. He told me he was in Detroit. I was really surprised. I didn't think I'd ever see him again, so you can imagine how I felt when he told me. I didn't know what to think. It was a bit of a shock. I knew I wasn't excited about seeing him. I knew he was trouble and that he might end up getting us exposed. I was right. Not long after learning that he was in Detroit, he started asking to see me. He was so persistent that I finally agreed to meet him. I knew he wasn't going to give up, so it was better to meet him. Even though I knew it was a bad idea, I also wanted to see him again. We met up for lunch. As I suspected, Nick was in trouble. This man barely wore any clothes to lunch and he was touching me the entire time. I was more calm when he did the same thing in Alabama, but I was really scared when he did it in Detroit. We were literally in the same city with my husband. I had to be careful with the things I did because it was risky, but I also had to act normal or else Nick would suspect. I have to say that was the most awkward lunch I've ever had. I had to keep my eyes open and look around just to make sure no one I knew was looking at us. But Nick was too impatient. He didn't care that we were in a public place after lunch. I had to rush back home. I also had to go pick the kids from school to make dinner for Ben, so it was tricky to meet up for lunch. Despite trying to get things done as quickly as possible, I wasn't able to finish in time. When Ben arrived back home, he asked me if I'd been out. I was surprised by the question because I hadn't been. I told him I was going out that day, so I had no idea how he found out. He got really angry and asked me why I left the kids at school for nearly an hour before picking them up. That's how I got caught out. Guys, I couldn't pick the kids up on time because I went to get groceries for dinner. I knew the teachers. We were going to call one of us, but I never imagined they would just call Ben without calling me first. When I didn't get a call, I thought they never called anyone. So I was actually surprised when Ben confronted me with all those questions. I was able to get out of that conversation by blaming the grocery store. I told him the store was too slow with processing my payment, which was a pretty lame excuse, but it seemed to do the trick. I guess I underestimated Ben's intelligence and thought that would be the end of it. I had no idea he'd be so determined to get to the bottom of things. Devil Nick invited me out a second time, this time for dinner. I tried to say no because I didn't want to get caught, but Nick was as persistent as ever and wouldn't take no for an answer. I had to be careful because going out at night without getting noticed was almost impossible. It took me a while to find the courage to go out on that particular night. I had to wait for the kids to fall asleep and then for Ben. He usually slept early because he had to wake up early for work, so it wasn't hard to wait for him after he dozed off. I went out to meet Nick. Nick decided I suggested we stay at a hotel, but I knew I couldn't sleep there. I told him that, but he begged me to stay whenever I met Nick. I started acting irrational and doing stupid things. That's exactly what happened. On that particular night, I had dinner with him, flirted with him, and kissed him many times in public. I think I let my guard down that night because I felt no one I knew would be out late. It also gave me peace of mind to know that Ben had fallen asleep. I slept in the hotel with Nick and then went back home. When I got back home the next morning, I was in for a shock. I saw boxes outside my house, which is every woman's nightmare. It's a horrible sight to see, but that's what greeted me. My heart started pounding because I'd left my boyfriend. I went to my boyfriend's hotel room to find his things outside his room, which was pretty scary. I had to stay strong and go in. When I got to the house, I was met by his parents in the living room with my parents. I was pretty shocked because I didn't understand what was going on. When I asked him about it, he showed me the video of me kissing Nick in the hotel restaurant the night before I was left speechless with nothing to say up until the time our parents spoke in our presence about where to keep the children. It all happened so fast and soon enough, my mother pulled me by the hair and dragged me out of the house. Even though my parents were scolding me and telling me how disappointed they were, I couldn't say anything because I couldn't believe I had been caught after being so careful. It turned out that Ben had followed me when he noticed I left the house. It didn't help that he had questioned my movements before the next day. On the day I called Nick and told him the truth about my marriage and my husband kicking me outside of the house, I'll stop here for now. I have to charge my device and go with my parents to Big Ben. I'll make an update soon. Hi guys, I'll continue from where I stopped. Nick actually got very angry when he heard Ben had done something wrong. I didn't tell him about my marriage, but he said it didn't matter because he was also in a relationship. I asked him if I could stay with him in Alabama, but he said no. He said he wanted to confront Ben and get answers. I knew it was a bad idea right away, but it ended up being the worst idea I've ever had. I was so shocked that he didn't change his mind. He made me take him to Ben's house after knocking tirelessly. When Ben saw me with Nick, he instantly realized what the visit was about. Nick tried to act like an alpha by raising his voice in nymph. He asked Ben why he'd thrown me out of the house. He said, "How dare you send the mother of your kids outside of your house like that?" I cringed at his words because I knew how weird the whole situation was. Ben tried to close the door in our faces, but Nick held it open and said, "I'm asking you a question." The next, I saw Ben grab Nick by the shoulder and kick him hard in the stomach before punching him in the face. It all happened so fast that if it hadn't been for the loud wailing and flinching sounds Nick was making, I wouldn't have understood what happened. Ben kept kicking and punching Nick. Even though Nick was struggling and fighting back, it was obvious that Ben was more angry than Nick was powerful. I didn't intervene until I saw blood gushing out of Nick's knee. I had to run in between them and try to calm the situation. But that only ended up with me on the floor. Ben didn't care. He just pushed me off. I had to leave the fence to call Ben to stop. Nick was badly injured and couldn't walk or stand properly. So I called an ambulance. I was surprised to be taking my AP to the hospital in an ambulance after my husband beat him up. Nick getting beat up was bad, but he had it coming. He didn't want to take responsibility for me, but I still ended up getting pushed to the ground in public. The worst part is that Nick made me pay his medical bill and blamed me for his injuries. He even went as far as blocking my phone number in front of me and telling me never to contact him again. He said that I was after his life and that I'd set him up with my husband. He tried to blackmail me into paying his bills or he'd file charges on me and my husband. I had to pay the bills because I didn't want any drama. Do you remember in the last update when I said I was going to beg Ben with my parents? It didn't end well. He said I was after his life and set him up with my husband. He blackmailed me into paying his bills or he would file charges on me and my husband. I had to pay the bills because I didn't want any drama. Do you guys remember in the last update I said I was going to beg Ben with my parents? It didn't end well, Ben. He's filed for divorce and isn't ready to forgive me. I'm getting a divorce. He even told my parents about my decision to bring my affair partner to his house. I didn't tell my parents before, which didn't help my case. They were so disappointed that they asked me to move out. I used all my savings too. I paid for Nick's medical bill so I'm short on cash. Nick has disappeared. I can't even walk with my head held high because people saw me running around the day Ben beat Nick up. I'm living in shame and with barely any money. On top of that, I'm going through a divorce and custody battle. All of this has taken a toll on me. I'm beyond exhausted. Ben left no stone unturned. He's refusing to pay child support because he wants full custody of our kids. He's trying to prove in court that I've abandoned them at school to go on dates. I've also abandoned them for a week just for a wedding. I can see him winning this battle with his qualified lawyers. He's done enough for me already. All of this is taking a toll on me mentally, emotionally, and financially. I've basically been doomed ever since I met Laura. I always believed that a bond built on trust was unbreakable. We'd been the envy of our circle with our tales of love lasting over 2 decades. I had no idea that a simple envelope would shatter that belief. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that paints the trees with a fiery hue and the wind carries secrets as I walked towards I got home from work that day and noticed a white envelope in our mailbox. There was no stamp, no address, just a handwritten note on the front. I was curious, so I quickly opened it. The letter was typed and the words sent a chill down my spine. Open your eyes. Mark, love can blind, but the truth can hurt even more. Then I saw the next line. Laura isn't as faithful as you think. I felt my heart skip a beat. My heart was racing. Laura, my Laura, cheating on me? No way. We'd spent more than 20 years together, sharing a home and everything that goes with it. This had to be a sick joke, but who would do such a thing and why? I looked around, half expecting to see a pair of sneering eyes watching me from the shadows, enjoying the aftermath of their cruel prank. The street was quiet with just the rustling leaves and my racing heartbeat breaking the silence. I put the letter in my briefcase and decided not to share it with Laura just yet. Instead, I resolved to keep an eye on her to watch for signs that could confirm or refute this terrible accusation. I believed in her, in us, yet there was this gnawing feeling at the pit of my stomach like a worm eating. Over the next few days, everything seemed normal. Laura was her usual chirpy self, filling our home with her laughter and love. However, I noticed something. Robert, our close friend for years, a man I'd shared countless memories with, was around more than usual. At first, I dismissed it as mere coincidence, but the signs started to become more obvious. They exchanged stolen glances when Niflheim. They thought I wasn't looking at the secret conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the knowing smiles that hinted at shared secrets. I wanted to confront her and ask her outright, but every time I mustered the courage, she'd look at me with those same eyes filled with love and my doubts would melt away. But the envelope's message remained lurking in the shadows, reminding me that sometimes what seems too good to be true usually is. Days turned into weeks and the suspicion inside me continued to grow. Each interaction between Laura and Robert became more significant and every whisper echoed loudly in my mind. Every touch sent an electric shock down my spine. The world around me started to shift and doubt clouded every beautiful memory we'd built. I'd always been a man of Povsudden. I decided to do some digging, so I started keeping tabs on Laura's whereabouts. I never thought I'd be doing that. I made notes on the times she'd take calls outside, her sudden late-night outings and those weekend get-togethers with girlfriends I'd never heard of. My journal was filling up with these observations, but it wasn't just notes. It was a testament to a crumbling foundation. While making another entry, I came across a receipt from a fancy restaurant. It was from one of those nights Laura said she had a girls' night out, but the total was too high for just one person. My heart raced as I recalled her coming home that night, her makeup slightly smudged and her demeanor slightly off. I decided to look into it further. I installed a discreet tracking app on Laura's phone. I felt bad about betraying her trust, but I had to know the truth. The app showed me where she went and it matched with Robert's. They were together at parks, cafes and even on one occasion, a secluded lakeside. One evening after another late night at work, I confronted Laura. Her face turned ashen as I listed my observations. My voice was trembling, barely concealing the heartbreak. But to my surprise, she laughed, a forced nervous laugh. She accused me of being paranoid, questioning my trust in our love and reminding me of our years together. She said, "Mark, you're seeing." There were no shadows, but her gaslighting made me question everything. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was all just my overactive imagination. Then Robert's wife, Emily, gave me a ray of hope or perhaps despair. She called me one morning, her voice trembling. She'd found signs, hints and whispers of betrayal too. We were dismissed, laughed at and accused of being delusional. We were two people who had been broken by the same deceit, seeking answers in a world that seemed to be shifting under our feet. Together, we decided to find undeniable proof and confront the liars that had torn our worlds apart. The hunt was on, and the stakes had never been higher. It was on one of those cool foggy mornings that I found solace in our. I was walking through the park when I noticed the mist clinging to the trees and the world feeling muffled and dreamlike. As I walked down the familiar paths, each step seemed to echo with memories of happier times, a far cry from the doubt and heartbreak I was currently experiencing. In the silence, I heard a familiar voice call out to me. I turned around and saw Jane, a mutual friend of Laura's and mine, with her son, when Jane had been there for us through thick and thin, through the good times and the bad. She'd been there for our highs and lows, our joys and sorrows. She came over and sat down on a nearby bench. The cold metal was a stark contrast to the warmth of memories associated with this place. I took a deep breath and told her everything, the letter, the tracking, the confrontation, and the alliance with Emily as I was telling her. I could see a mixture of sympathy and concern in Jane's eyes when I finished. There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of what I'd said hanging in the air. After what felt like an eternity, Jane finally spoke. Her voice was filled with sadness, and I'd never heard her like that before. "Mark," she began hesitatingly. "There's something I think you should know." She revealed that she'd seen Laura and Robert together on multiple occasions over the past few months. They'd been at cafes, malls, and even at Jane's own birthday party. They always found corners to whisper, share fleeting touches, and exchange looks filled with a secret intimacy. Initially, Jane hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was just close friendship. However, as the instances grew, her own suspicions began to mount. She even recalled a particular evening when she caught them sharing a much too intimate moment in her garden. Jane's revelations were like a hammer to my already fragile heart, but what she said next was even more shocking. Robert was known to be manipulative in the past. He had charmed and deceived others, leaving a trail of broken relationships in his wake. His modus operandi was always the same: befriend, charm, and then destroy. Laura wasn't his first victim, and if left unchecked, she wouldn't be his last. I felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, but more than anything, I felt a sense of determination with Jane's insights and Emily's support, and based on my own observations, I was building a case, not just against Robert, but against the shadows of doubt and deceit that had crept into my life. It was time to bring everything to light and confront the two people who had betrayed me. I was at the center of the storm. The following week, I meticulously planned a confrontation with Jane and Emily's help. We arranged for a dinner at my house. The pretense was simple: a reunion of old friends, and we were getting together to have a good time and catch up on what we'd been up to. Robert and Laura had no idea what was going on. At least, they didn't show any signs of it. The evening started off nice and relaxed. The sun was setting, and the room was filled with soft music and laughter. It felt like everything was going to be okay, but as we moved to the living room for coffee after dinner, things started to get tense. I took the lead with a deep breath. I want to be clear that tonight isn't just about memories or celebrating friendship. It's also about confronting the shadows that have crept into our lives. The room went silent. Laura's face turned pale, and Robert shifted uncomfortably. I continued laying out all the evidence from the letter to Jane's revelations, from the tracking results to the emotional pain that their deceit had inflicted on Emily and me. The atmosphere was thick with emotion. Accusations flew. Voices raised. Tears were shed, and the facade of deception began to crumble. Robert, in a desperate attempt to deflect blame, tried to portray himself as the victim. He spoke of loneliness and feeling unappreciated, and how Laura was a beacon of hope in his desolate life. Laura, on the other hand, seemed lost and confused. She alternated between expressing remorse and accusing me of smothering her with my insecurities. She admitted to being swayed by Robert's charm, but also expressed her frustration at feeling taken for granted in our relationship. They were my rock, my support system. They called out every lie and every avoidance tactic, reminding Robert and Laura of the pain they caused, the trust they broke, and the lives they tore apart. Hours passed, and the room was a battlefield of emotions. The scars of betrayal were laid bare for all to see. As the first light of dawn started to peek through, one thing was clear. Relationships were forever altered.